And now, Rachel B. Gross. Rachel Gross is an associate professor and the John and Marcia Goldman Chair in American Jewish Studies in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. She is a religious studies scholar who teaches 20th and 21st century history. Her book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, is a 2021 National Jewish Book Award finalist in American Jewish Studies. She is currently writing a book about the spiritual adventures of the 20th century Jewish writer, Mary Antin. And now it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Rachel B. Gross, on Feeling Jewish, Nostalgia, and American Jewish Religion. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Riva. Thanks for that introduction and thanks for having me. The background is pulling up. I am glad to be here, glad to be back here. 2 years ago, I spoke in this program about my work on artisanal delis. And since I don't expect you all to have attended that, or for anybody who attended it to actually remember it 2 years later, if you do happen to remember it, you'll forgive me that there is some slight overlap between these two talks as they're both drawn from research I did for my book. So as Riva shared, I teach in a Jewish studies department at SF State, and my training is in academic religious studies. Religious studies can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different scholars, but for me, being a religious studies scholar means asking questions about how people make meaning in their lives. And like many other religious studies scholars, I think of one of the goals of religious studies as making the strange familiar and making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So my work for this project has been particularly on making the familiar strange. So a lot of my work has been analyzing everyday activities that we might otherwise take for granted. And I think about the ways that we tell stories about ourselves, our families, and our communities through everyday activities, and the ways that we ask weighty existential questions like, who am I and where do I come from? These are really ordinary, everyday questions, but I think they are still remarkable ones. So I want to begin with one of my favorite ordinary moments from my research on the ways I see American Jews making meaning in their lives and asking existential, ordinary questions. So one summer, I watched visitors to the beautiful museum at Eldridge Street sit down in the pews of the restored 1887 Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side. And they listened to a docent tell the history of this grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jewish immigrants. When the docent finishes, she leads them out of the sanctuary, but she stops right at the back of the room. And she says, step into the indentations in the floorboards. And soon people have arranged themselves into straight lines. And pointing to the pattern of indentations, she says, why do you think these are here? Why do you think you've ended up in straight lines? And slowly, the group realizes that they are standing in the footprints of former male congregants. And the indentations have been made by men shuckling, rocking back and forth in front of their pew as they prayed in the traditional Jewish fashion. Over the years, they had left their mark in the soft pine floorboards. Sometimes the docent demonstrates this movement and others copy her. And some of the tourists are familiar with the rocking motion from their own synagogue services. Some of them are shuffling awkwardly, if enthusiastically. But standing in the footprints of former congregants provides an immediate sensory connection to the past, one that engages visitors' entire bodies. An experience is a highlight for many tourists. Somebody wrote on Yelp, you literally feel the history at your feet. So the docent's careful orchestration of this moment helps visitors to experience a connection to the past that is both physical and emotional. So, in my book, Beyond the Synagogue Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, um, uh, don't mind the discount code. As one of my mentors says, nobody should feel obliged to buy the book, but if you do, you should not pay retail. So here's the discount code. In my book, I look at the materials and the institutions through which American Jews engage, promote, and teach nostalgia for turn of the century Jewish immigration from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States. And I find that nostalgia, a sentimental longing, in this case for Jewish community origins that can't be fulfilled, nostalgia's longing for a past that is irrevocably past. Nostalgia can be both an emotion and a practice. And as a feeling and as a practice, I argue that nostalgia has become such an important part of American Jewish religion since the 19 has become an important part of American Jewish religion since the 1970s and into the present day. So, in this book, I look at 4 case studies. I look at the materials of Jewish genealogists and their institutions, historic synagogues that are used as museums, like the Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side, children's books and dolls, and artisanal delis and other Jewish food sites. Some of you will recognize that this is Saul's Deli in Berkeley. So I find that some of these items and the institutions that create, promote, distribute them encourage American Jews to feel nostalgia for a particular story about Ashkenazi history, the history of Jews whose ancestors came from Central and Eastern Europe, and that nostalgia is best understood as part of American Jewish religion. So if I'm going to make this argument, I have to expand our understanding of what counts as religious practice and where we look for religious activities. So, what I'm going to do in the rest of the time where I'm talking at you is think about what kind of nostalgia I'm talking about, what we mean by nostalgia, and what I mean by religion. I'll trace the historical development of American Jewish nostalgia, the forms that it takes, and the places where I see it. And I'm going to wrap up by thinking about one of the implications of taking this kind of nostalgia seriously. Some scholars and Jewish community leaders worry very loudly that American Jews' religiosity is in decline. But I think that my research shows us that American Judaism is not in decline, but is in fact evolving and flourishing. So, what are we talking about when we talk about religion? A lot of religious studies scholars are increasingly realizing that the concept of religion, as we normally think about it, is primarily a modern Protestant creation. When we think about recognizable acts of worship and personal belief as religion, that's really shaped by modern Protestantism rather than by other traditions. But even though some Jewish thinkers and community leaders have deliberately worked really hard to make Judaism fit this model, literally, it was the job of many Jewish thinkers to say Judaism is a religion and here's why, and kind of squeezing Judaism into this Protestant model. I think that divisions between Jewish religion and Jewish culture flatten the dynamic ways that American Jews make meaning in their lives. So, how would I define religion? I think that religion is best understood as meaningful relationships and the practices, narratives, and emotions that create and support these relationships. So, building on a whole lot of other scholarship, I'm not the only one to say this. This is a big conversation in religious studies. We might think of religion as relationships among sacred relationships among the living, between the living and the dead, or between humans and the divine. And each of those kinds of relationships, the sacred community between us and our ancestors, between us and God, each of those kinds of sacred relationships can be emphasized in different ways and in different times. One of my teachers, religious studies scholar Catherine Lofton, says religion is a way of describing the structures by which we are bound or connected to one another. So, thinking about people's relationships with their families, their communities, their ancestors, and the divine as central to religion lets us think about how individuals who don't see themselves as religious still make meaning in their lives in really creative ways, as well as how those who do see themselves as religious find meaning both within and beyond traditional practices, and how they're guided by a variety of supposedly secular institutions and materials. And behind me is a collage of family photographs and illustrations of the writer and artist Sheldon Oberman, to which I'll return later in the talk. But I think this is a lovely example of those kind of sacred relationships. And I see that comments and questions are coming in the chat, which is terrific. Please drop them there and we'll turn to them together at when I finish this talk. But please feel free to drop them in now. So, definitions of religion. I get to spend my academic career, thinking about definitions of religion, and I feel so lucky to get to do that. But I think that I think that definitions of religion are not just matters of academic theory. I think there's something that we all should think about. I am motivated by 3 reasons for thinking really broadly about religion. So I think these are 3 reasons why we should all think carefully about how we define religion. First, how we define religion has serious legal implications in the United States. Definitions of religion and religious freedom have been used to strengthen white Protestants' claims to racial and religious supremacy. Organizations denoted as religious don't pay taxes, and we give other privileges to religious groups and spaces too. Native Americans, for instance, have repeatedly made the case, usually unsuccessfully, that their practices and spaces count as religious in a legal sense for these reasons. So I don't think the things that I'm going to be talking about today are likely to get counted as religious in a legal sense anytime soon. But I do think that it's really important for us to know that the stakes of thinking about what is religion are really high. And it's actually something that we debate all of the time, including in our courts. Second, in the Jewish community, many decisions about large-scale philanthropy are made in ways that are related to what counts as religion. So a lot of major philanthropists have been persuaded to give money to Jewish organizations that are ultimately designed to make Jews, especially young Jews, either more traditionally religious or more tied to the recognizable institutions of American Jewish religion. And then third, so a lot of money is at stake. And then third, and maybe most importantly to me, I think that thinking broadly about religion offers a new and better way of analyzing how we and how other people make meaning in our lives and how we place ourselves inside stories that we think are important. So I'm offering you this scholarly theory of religion, and you can take it or leave it. But I do want to offer it to you as a way of thinking slightly differently about how we all make meaning in our lives. So, thinking about American Jews' nostalgia for Eastern European heritage helps us think about how religion works for many American Jews. American Jews' nostalgic activities connect them to communities that include both the living and the dead. They provide meaning in the present by telling stories about the past, 2 important features of religious practice. So, these nostalgic forms build on traditional religious forms of Jewish memory, like how participants at a Seder, the home ritual for Passover, recite that they too should feel as if they'd been freed from Egypt. So that's a traditional Jewish memory practice. But thinking about nostalgia as an American Jewish religious practice also helps us think about how American Jews make meaning in their lives beyond holidays and beyond traditional ritual practices in our everyday lives. So, what I'm doing in this project, in thinking about how nostalgia for Eastern European heritage has become so important, so prevalent, so institutionalized and standardized that it should be understood as part of American Jewish religion, all of this is related to some recent critiques of what some people call Ashkenormativity. Maybe you've heard of this word, maybe you haven't. Ashkenormativity is a word that draws attention to the ways that European Jewish heritage, especially Eastern European Jewish heritage, is prioritized in American Jewish cultures, and the ways that we often assume that Ashkenazi heritage is the Jewish identity to the detriment of Sephardi, Mizrahi, and other non-Ashkenazi backgrounds. So I think that if we want to critique Ashkenormativity, the first thing we need to do is know how it works, including through these nostalgic stories of Eastern European immigration. So, of course, the tourists at the museum at Eldridge Street did not just happen to arrive at the historic synagogue and place their feet in the grooves of long ago congregants. Excuse me. American Jews have long seen the Lower East Side as a site of authentic emotional connection to community history. Jewish history in the Americas dates back to the earliest years of European colonialism, but as you may know, the vast majority of American Jews are descended from Central and Eastern Europeans who immigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1924. Many of them settled in New York's Lower East Side, behind me, and other urban immigrant neighborhoods. And in the early to mid 20th century, they began to move their families out of these crowded neighborhoods for more spacious parts of the city and the suburbs. But they kept thinking about the old neighborhood, and some of them kept coming back. In the early 20th century, the Jews who left the Lower East Side were continually replaced by new arrivals until Congress severely limited immigration in 1924. And then leaping ahead, beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, as what scholars call a white ethnic revival turned many Americans' attention to their ancestries, American Jews thought about their former urban ethnic neighborhoods with nostalgic longing. And as they did so, American Jews reflected together on this history in a number of different ways. In the mid 1970s, they were inspired by the African American roots movement of that era, which was named for Alex Haley's book, 1976 book, Roots. It was an imaginative history of an African American family. Inspired by the Roots movement, American Jewish genealogists began to organize and educate themselves, writing manuals and creating Jewish genealogical societies. A decade later, in the 1980s, historians and preservationists started paying attention really seriously to the role that historians and preservationists started paying attention in earnest to the role that historic synagogues could play in Jewish public life. Again, that's the Eldridge Street Synagogue. They just have a lot of great photos. In the 1990s, mainstream publishing houses started publishing an increasing number of children's books depicting stories of Jewish immigration as part of the American story of multiculturalism. And then in the 21st century, the Eastern European Jewish culinary revival began in earnest with the appearance of new artisanal delis and other businesses created by Jewish food entrepreneurs. So American Jews could connect to this past and other Jewish histories through a variety of other older types of Jewish institutions and media, such as passively watching a movie or a live performance of Fiddler on the Roof. But I think that the new materials of nostalgia that I'm looking at encourage a more active personal longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history, a connection between your own family history and larger community stories. Longing is active, not passive. So Jewish genealogists actively research their family histories. Parents read illustrated books aloud and encourage children to play with toys. And restaurant patrons literally consume their longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history. Visitors at historic synagogues step into the footprints of past congregants, literally and metaphorically, and the tour guides at the museum at Elger Street work hard to bring visitors into the story. Nostalgic forms of pop culture help pass stories and values on to future generations. So, we don't normally take restaurants seriously, either as sites of religion or as sites of public history. Public history are programs or institutions like museums that teach history to a broad public. But restaurants can actually significantly shape emotional reactions to certain historical stories. Eating is a really intimate act that encourages asking and answering questions about yourself, your identity, and your community. And Jewish restaurants encourage their patrons to tell their family stories. Elise Lerner, the owner of On Rye, and unfortunately since closed deli in Washington, D.C., told me a lot of people come in and they want to tell us their experiences that they've had with this food growing up. Many restaurateurs and purveyors of Jewish food tell stories of their family histories and of Jewish community histories through their food, their decor, their presentation. And like all sites of public history, these eateries have a particular point of view. So for Karen Edelman, the co-owner of Saul's Deli nearby in Berkeley, the principal story told in Saul's Deli, she told me, is that of Ashkenazi Jews from the Old World and New York, and then they keep going west until they reach California, which is, I just love this framing because it makes Saul's Deli and its patrons the pinnacle of Jewish history. So I love this line as somebody who lives nearby in San Francisco. It really makes Berkeley and Saul's the center of Jewish history. Nostalgia places individuals and communities within stories that matter and stories that matter emotionally. These new forms of American Jewish public history often invoke thinking critically about the past and about the effect of the past on the present. And they can challenge who we think of as an authority on Jewish history, identity, and practice. So, the Jewish culinary revivalists that I study, these folks engaged in artisanal delis and places like Saul's that think carefully about where their food comes from. All of these folks are thinking deliberately about making American Jewish food fit for the 21st century. They reimagine classic Ashkenazi dishes in light of concerns about sustainability, reliance on local goods, and the slow food movement, as well as their emotional resonance. So when Karen Edelman and Peter Levitt bought Saul's Deli in Berkeley from its founding owners, many of the restaurant's ingredients were shipped from New York to Berkeley. And Karen and Peter were participating in the Bay Area's food movement, and they began to reshape their menu with local and seasonal ingredients. They wanted to honor Ashkenazi American cuisine even as they elevated it. But they ran into a pickle problem, as one does in matters of Ashkenazi food. Um, as you may or may not know, a half sour pickle is properly made from a fresh cucumber and eaten 6 to 20 days after pickling. After 20 days, you probably don't have a half sour pickle on your hand. You probably have a full sour pickle on your hand, which is delicious, but a slightly different thing. So Karen and Peter wanted to serve pickles made from local cucumbers, which are grown between June and November. But deli customers expected a half sour pickle to be available all year round. And for at least some time at Saul's Deli, customers had to endure having half sour pickles alongside their sandwiches at Saul's only in seasonally appropriate months, along with lessons in agriculture, geography, and Jewish culinary history. So, as you can imagine, this was a hard lesson for some customers to swallow, so to speak. So, I want to suggest that the purveyors, the creators of nostalgic American Jewish public history, who are deliberately working to create community around certain materials of Jewish public history, should be considered a kind of Jewish community leader or even a religious expert. Jewish genealogists, museum staff members, children's book authors, and restaurateurs create and curate the materials that are designed to elicit particular emotional and I would say religious reactions to certain Jewish stories. They are Jews who have rarely been recognized as leaders or as experts, either in academic conversations or at Jewish community conversations, and they don't always necessarily see themselves as Jewish leaders. I think that acknowledging their leadership, the leadership of these content creators, points to the importance of these new types of Jewish community organizations and recognizes the ways in which they now guide American Jews at least as much as those whose Jewish community leadership has been recognized throughout much of the 20th century, such as rabbis and directors of Jewish federations, American Zionist organizations, certain other Jewish nonprofits like JCCs. Excuse me, need to hydrate. Looking at the practices of nostalgia, like genealogy, in fact, helps us break down the binaries between religious leaders and lay practitioners. So, for instance, a respected Jewish genealogist might be either a professional or an amateur genealogist. I think this is so interesting. People who solely research their own genealogy, people who solely research their own genealogy are always amateur genealogists. And if you research somebody else's genealogy for pay, you're a professional genealogist. So there's a very different understanding of what amateur and professional is here than we usually use these terms. Amateur and professional genealogists generally do the same research with the same tools, and most genealogists, amateur or professional, are not formally trained in historical research. Most of them have learned research skills informally through practice and from other genealogists. Jewish genealogists who are respected by their communities are those who uphold community standards while honoring their family histories by researching and memorializing them through physical and digital records, telling family stories, saying Kaddish, the Jewish mourner's prayer, among other practices that create material and emotional connections to Jewish family and community histories. In contrast to the explicitly theological understanding of genealogical research that Latter-day Saints have, Jewish genealogical research, as you will know, is not an officially recognized religious practice with implications for salvation. It is for Latter-day Saints. In the 1970s, as Jewish genealogy took off, Jewish genealogists learned a great deal from Latter-day Saints who had done the foundational genealogical research and also from the religious meaning that Latter-day Saints found in the practice. At the same time, Jews wanted to distance themselves from Latter-day Saints' practice of baptizing the dead. So Dan Rottenberg, who wrote the first American Jewish genealogy manual, his 1977 Finding Our Fathers, wrote, "Each time I have uncovered the name of one of my long forgotten ancestors, I have been filled with the mystical feeling that I was indeed rescuing that ancestor, not from hellfire perhaps, but from oblivion." As Jewish genealogists have searched for their own language to articulate what they see as the deep meaning of genealogy, the fact that it is not officially recognized as a religious rite has actually allowed them, I think, a greater freedom of interpretation about the meaning of their practices. And behind me are Jewish genealogists looking at a memorial plaque. You might recognize this from synagogues. These boards, as you may know, are often hung in synagogues to record the yahrzeit or the death date of congregants' ancestors, reminding them when to say the mourner's prayer on the anniversary of their ancestor's death. And on this board, the little red lights are turned on during the week of an ancestor's death date. Jewish genealogists have recently started efforts to transcribe and digitally index these valuable records. And I love this as a particularly Jewish example of Jewish genealogy, one that utilizes traditional Jewish ritual objects in the service of a new memorial practice of digitizing these records. Now, just because the creators and curators of American Jewish nostalgia should be considered religious leaders doesn't mean that audiences listen to them uncritically. This is something with which other religious leaders are definitely familiar, certainly from Jewish audiences. Certainly, many Jews are not interested in listening to the family genealogist stories, unfortunately. Meanwhile, at historic synagogues, docents and staff members are often providing rules of acceptable behavior to visitors. This is how you behave in this historic space. But as I observed, as I did this research, Jewish visitors especially routinely refuse to observe these guidelines. If you've spent time around Jews, you will not be surprised. Jewish visitors approach historic Jewish spaces with a sense of entitlement. This is something that staff members work to encourage even as they try to regulate visitors' behavior. Am I having trouble? Can you still hear me? Can somebody nod that you can still hear me? I feel like something changed with my headphones. Great. Thank you, Claire. Let's see. Thanks so much, Claire. I appreciate that. Jewish deli owners, especially those telling stories of Jewish immigration beyond New York, are also navigating conflicts with customers. Deli owners routinely told me that customers constantly compare restaurants outside New York to their ideal of a New York deli, even if the customers have not been to an actual New York deli in years, and even if restaurateurs repeatedly insist that they do not want to emulate a New York deli. So at Saul's Deli, Edelman and Levitt explained to customers, recreating the New York deli is not our charge. Food, authenticity, flavor, sustainability, survival, and being true to the values of our culinary roots are our first priority. So, like other Jewish culinary revivalists, Edelman and Levitt attempt to alter customers' framework of authenticity from emulating an ideal place, that ideal image of New York, to new narratives about Jewish food, history, and memory. Nostalgia helps give us an emotional connection to the past, but it also encourages the most simplistic, streamlined versions of any story. The nostalgic longing of American Jews for stories of Eastern European immigration at the turn of the century and for Eastern European past deliberately centers certain Ashkenazi experiences, and it necessarily marginalizes other Jewish stories. So, American Jewish genealogists might find that they have diverse backgrounds, but many I have found are drawn to family stories of Eastern European immigration that fit the bigger picture, the story that many Jewish institutions tell. So, by necessity, the materials and practices of nostalgia exclude certain people and certain stories and are going to encourage what we sometimes call Ashkenormativity. Nostalgic materials, in fact, tell us about whose stories matter the most. One perhaps surprising place where I see American Jewish community leadership is American Girl. Some of you may or may not be familiar with this. This is a wildly popular Mattel-owned line of dolls, books, and accessories, including a line of historical characters representing 8 to 10-year-old girls at various points in American history. In the summer of 2009, American Jewish, Ashkenazi, Eastern European Jewish immigration history was officially introduced into the American Girl canon with the debut of this Rebecca Rubin character. She's the 10th character in the historical series, and the Rebecca doll, books, and accessories created the fictional character of a Jewish 9-year-old girl living in Manhattan's Lower East Side in 1914. And like all of the American Girl dolls, the Rebecca doll is 18 inches tall. She has vinyl limbs and face, a stuffed cloth body that you can squeeze, and eyes that open and close. The Rebecca doll and books illustrations depict a girl with wavy mid-tone brown hair. You can imagine they had big fights over what color hair she was going to have. And in the initial release, the doll wore this smart red herringbone dress. And the doll was initially accompanied by 6 illustrated chapter books describing her adventures as a spunky, conflicted, compassionate, and determined daughter of Russian immigrants. And there were a whole bunch of miniature accessories, tiny things that echoed the illustrations that you can also buy. These books were written by Jewish children's book author Jacqueline Denber Green. And she had previously written children's books about Sephardi Jewish history, and her own ancestry includes Sephardi Jews. And she told me that when she worked on her story proposals to American Girl, she considered telling a Sephardi story. She also considered placing the story of an Ashkenazi Jewish immigrant in Boston, which is where she lives. But she ultimately decided, and I think with good reason, that the mainstream story of Eastern European immigrants in New York needed to be told first. And I think that's a big reason why they chose her story proposals. For many Jewish and non-Jewish consumers of American Girl, Rebecca Rubin is the Jewish story, and it matters that this story was told first. So the Rebecca Rubin doll and books teach American children of all backgrounds to feel a connection to a particular American Jewish heritage narrative as a way of being American in general, regardless of their family history. And the doll, books, and miniature accessories all encourage this emotional connection to Jewish immigration history as American identity through children's play and consumer desires. Sometimes other people's stories are folded into Ashkenazi stories. The menu at Saul's Deli, as some of you may know, offers a number of dishes from Middle Eastern cuisine inspired by Jewish cultures in that region. And serving selective Middle Eastern dishes allows Saul's to serve more vegan and vegetarian entrees, which you will know is important for a restaurant in Berkeley, but can be challenging for a Jewish deli. Karen told me that broadening that story a little bit is a sidestep that's a little bit inclusive of both more Jewish past and more customers, and allows Saul's to continue to tell the story of Jewish food. So I really respect and understand their decision to include Middle Eastern food, but I want to point out that at the same time, this inclusion folds non-Ashkenazi Jewish histories into the narrative of Eastern European nostalgia. So the side dish might be Middle Eastern, but the larger platter and the deli itself remain focused on Central and Eastern European Jewish heritage. And I think that what this does is it really points to some of the really challenging difficulties of moving beyond what we might call Ashkenormativity, especially in these spaces, and folding other people's histories into what are already Ashkenazi institutions, and points us to maybe thinking about new kinds of institutions to tell new kinds of stories. And behind me is Challah food truck, like challah, get it, in Columbus, Ohio, which did similar work. So tensions around negotiating boundaries show up in children's books too. Some of you might be familiar with the books distributed by PJ Library, which is a program that distributes free children's books and music with Jewish content to Jewish and interfaith families. I don't know if the Contra Costa JCC is a PJ Library partner, but I suspect it might be. And the organization, PJ Library, emphasizes that children's books are not just for children, but that they're meant to be read aloud by older family members who, like children, should be receptive to their messages about Jewish history and values. One of the books that has been distributed over the years by PJ Library is honestly, one of my favorite books, The Always Prayer Shawl, which tells the story of a boy's immigration from Eastern Europe to North America. Shelton Oberman, the author, was Canadian, but he made the story generically American to appeal to readers in the United States. My Canadian friends tell me this is a very Canadian thing to do. And the boy in the story brings with him his grandfather's prayer shawl from Eastern Europe to North America, and he eventually passes on the prayer shawl to his own grandson. So the Always Prayer Shawl tells a particular story of Jewish immigration. It in fact came out of Oberman's experience inheriting his own grandfather's talit, his prayer shawl, and giving a talit to his own son. Oberman encouraged audiences of all backgrounds to find themselves in his story of heirlooms and of intergenerational connections. And he frequently wore his grandfather's prayer shawl while reading the real prayer shawl while he was reading his book, The Always Prayer Shawl, aloud to audiences, which does this really interesting work of expanding the religious use of the garment to wear it at a children's book reading. And at one of these readings, a non-Jewish author complimented Oberman and said, "I wish I could tell stories like you." And he responded by taking the talit off of his shoulders, placing it around her shoulders, and saying, "Yes, you can do it." So the prayer shawl and Oberman's story comfortably incorporate Jews and non-Jews into the emotions and this network of relationships of North American Jewish nostalgia. And I think that nostalgia can serve American Jews as a type of religious practice, but it's also a form of religious practice in which the boundaries, the community boundaries, are a little bit looser. So I know I'm running out of time. I see Riva jumping on. I want to, hopefully I have a few more minutes to wrap up by thinking about how nostalgic activities like touring the museum at Eldridge Street, reading a children's book, buying a pastrami sandwich at a deli can help us respond to the claims of Jewish community leaders and sociologists who see Jewish religion on the decline in the United States. Since the mid 20th century, American Jewish community leaders have worried loudly that American Jews' religiosity is waning, something that they describe as assimilation into mainstream American culture. And this behind me is Look magazine's famous 1964 cover story about the vanishing American Jew. I'm obliged as an American Jewish historian to point out that Look magazine no longer exists, but American Jews, of course, still do. That's an obligatory joke. In recent decades, Jewish community leaders have worried about the effects of intermarriage in what's been called a marriage crisis or a continuity crisis. But who is claiming that we have this crisis? Congregational rabbis tend to have a prescriptive definition of religion. They are focused on things you do, like going to synagogue or performing holiday and life cycle celebrations. And looking for activities that can be measured, quantitative sociologists who are doing a lot of pushing this narrative are going to have similar definitions. They are going to be focused on things that they can measure, like attending synagogue, keeping kosher, sending children to Jewish religious schools. And the most recent national study of American Jews comes out of this legacy. It divides Jews into Jews by religion. Those are folks who tell surveyors that their current religion is Jewish. And Jews of no religion, which is a very weird definition. Those are people who answer a follow-up question by saying that they consider themselves Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background. But I think that American Jews, like a lot of other Americans, are just not very good at naming religion in their lives. The division between Jews by religion and Jews of no religion, and the related worries about the decline of American Jewish religion, are incorrectly identifying the ways that Jews think about and practice Judaism in the United States. When Jewish community leaders and sociologists distinguish between Jewish culture and Jewish religion, a lot of the ways that Jews create meaning in their lives as individuals, families, and communities are flattened or even erased. And I think that a lot of fears about assimilation resist the idea that Judaism, like all human endeavors, has and always will change over time. They're really relying on the idea of a static Judaism and a static American culture. And they really see the two as mutually exclusive rather than as continually responsive to one another. So we can see the dynamic nature of American Jewish religion in the practices of Jewish genealogists, at historic synagogues, in Jewish children's books, and at delis. And again, one word for the ways that we make meaning as individuals, families, and communities is religion. So thank you so much. And I think I need to reset my headphones, but thank you so much. And I hope Riva will take it from there.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. So let's look at some questions from people. From David, what is relationships between Jewish nostalgia and popularity of Jewish culture? Fiddler on the Roof, for instance, by a wide variety of non-Jews and recent rise in anti-Semitism.
I'm so sorry, Riva. I had to reset my
I'm
headphones.
sorry.
Can you repeat that?
What is the relationship between Jewish nostalgia and popularity of Jewish culture, such as Fiddler on the Roof, by a wide variety of non-Jews and the recent rise in anti-Semitism?
Oh, there's a lot going on there. I'm not sure about, is the question about anti-Semitism then? That's I guess, so is the question about non-Jews participating in Jewish culture, or is the question about non-Jews participating in Jewish culture? And then how does it relate to anti-Semitism?
Well, let's do the latter.
Okay. I don't know. I am not a scholar of anti-Semitism, and I think you can, a lot of folks who do study anti-Semitism would say that it is perfectly possible to engage Jewish culture and also not understand Jews or not fully appreciate Jews in the way that we might like. We can think about the way that certainly many people embrace aspects of Native American heritage, but might not recognize Native Americans as full and living human beings. So I wonder if that's what this questioner is thinking of. But I don't think that there's a one-to-one relationship between consuming Jewish culture and either appreciating Jews as full embodied people or anti-Semitism. I think that's not going to be a one-to-one relationship, though I do really appreciate the question.
Another question. Sorry, but to me, all isolated facts, ideas do not support the thesis that nostalgia is religion. But the Passover Seder could be called nostalgia and is very religious.
Okay, so first of all, that's fine. Nobody has to what I'm doing in this, nobody has to agree. And I certainly welcome disagreement. Again, what I'm doing in this talk is offering you one scholarly theory and one scholarly approach to thinking about how we make meaning in our lives. And if that doesn't speak to you, that's fine. And if it does, I hope it'll stay with you and you can think about what are the ways I make meaning in my life? What are the ways I make meaning in my life? And how do I connect to larger stories? And I think nostalgia in particular helps us connect emotionally, helps us connect our own stories and our family stories to larger stories. So I actually don't think, I think the Passover Seder itself is the work of memory, but not nostalgia, because I don't think it's itself particularly sentimental. But when we sit down at a Passover Seder, many of us are going to remember all of the other times that we sat at a Seder with our families, with our friends. We're going to think about the times that if we have Jewish ancestry, we're going to think about, we're going to imagine our grandparents and our ancestors sitting at Seders in different times and places around the world. And I think that is nostalgia, that emotional, sentimental connection. That's nostalgia. So a Seder can absolutely be nostalgic, but the Seder itself, the Haggadah, is usually not nostalgic itself. That's the work that we are bringing to it. So thanks for that comment. I appreciate it.
Another question, what is the difference between sacred relationships between people and non-sacred relationships or secular relationships?
I think that's really fuzzy. And I don't want to draw a hard line, because I think that sacred relationships are, I would say, the ones that help us understand who we are in the world. So a sacred relationship, I would say, might be the one that you have with, if you go to a synagogue community, even if you're not going to get along with everybody in your synagogue community, right? We all know this. But thinking about that community might help you understand who you are in the world if you're a person who goes to a synagogue. Thinking not everybody has really powerful relationships with their family. Some people are going to reject that for all kinds of healthy reasons, right? But those family relationships that help you understand who you are in the world, those friend relationships, those friends who are like family that help us tell bigger stories about ourselves. To me, I would think of those as sacred relationships, the ones that help us ask and answer big questions about who we are in the world and how we understand ourselves.
Another question. Um, if a person celebrates both their Jewish heritage and Jesus in church, is this Judaism?
Okay, I am not entirely sure how that connects. But in um for Jewish, that would be answered really differently by some Jewish studies scholars and some rabbis. Certainly, that's actually the hard line that Israel draws. They say you have the right of return to Israel if you have Jewish ancestry on your mother's line and can document it in certain ways, unless you accept Jesus as a Christian. They're going to say, no, that person is not a Jew. Rabbis might have a variety of answers. Rabbis are probably going to most rabbis that I know are probably going to have an answer like the state of Israel's, but for Jewish studies scholars, my job is not to tell people how to practice Judaism. I am offering you one way to think about Judaism. And I always say to my students in my Jewish studies class that for our purposes, who are we studying? We're studying people who identify themselves as Jews. So for me, as a Jewish studies scholar, I am interested in studying anybody who identifies themselves as a Jew. And for me, that's within my field of study. And within that, I have more narrow projects. But that's who I'm interested in studying. But again, as a Jewish studies scholar, it's not my job to tell anybody how to practice any religion, but to offer you ways of thinking about the world.
Thank you. I want to mention that this program, and I forgot to mention it originally, is co-sponsored by New Lair House. So my apologies to New Lair House. I want to thank you. Wonderful talk, wonderful answers to questions. And we look forward to having you next year when you talk about Christmas and Hanukkah. And I'm very interested in how you're going to discuss it. Everyone, thank you very much for coming to this program. And I hope you will join us at 3:30 tomorrow for another Under One Tent talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reva. Thanks, everyone.